The Waters of Mnemosyne are a reference to the Orphic mysteries. And the Orphic mysteries, the mystery traditions, the ancient Hellenic world, all have to do with what happens to you after you die, essentially. So they change something in your pattern after you die. And the Orphic mysteries in particular are pretty explicit about the fact that this has to do with reincarnation. And it has to do with, in some level, maintaining a continuity of consciousness across the bridge of death and rebirth, which doesn't mean that you remember everything. I don't remember everything I did last week, much less everything I did 20 years ago or 2000 years ago, but that it can build that bridge so that you're maintaining some level of continuity of consciousness, because the really difficult thing as mortal beings is that we die and we come back and we have to start over. So it's kind of like constantly going back to kindergarten over and over again. And if you believe in the possibilities of spiritual evolution individually and collectively, which I do, then that is a huge challenge that needs to be overcome. So if you can come back in and have some sort of pathway where you get back to what you used to know in terms of your wisdom faster, then you have a chance of growing further.
Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead. In this episode, it was an honor to speak with Dr. Gwendolyn Reece. Gwendolyn is a pagan priestess, a polytheist, an academic, and the author of The Waters of Mnemosyne. Gwendolyn serves as a respected teacher and community leader in the Washington, D.C. area and farther afield, and we met for the first time at the Sacred Space Conference this past March. It was wonderful to, in this conversation, touch on many of the themes that she brings forward in her work, in her books, and her teachings: the nature of sacred memory, reincarnation, the role of mystery and philosophy in life as a polytheist, and what it means to be in right relationships with communities. We also explored questions about modern households and families, sacred pilgrimages to Greece, and the love of wisdom that underlies devotional practices. Just a quick reminder, you can always follow Coffee and Divination over on Instagram and find me there. You are welcome to DM me to talk about our episodes. And please be sure to check out our new YouTube channel if you'd like to watch the shows. As always, if you take a moment to subscribe and leave us a 5-star review, it really helps others find us. And I hope you enjoy this conversation with Dr. Gwendolyn Reece. It is my pleasure to welcome to the show Gwendolyn Reece. I am so excited to have her as a guest. As you've heard from the intro, we got to meet briefly at Sacred Space this year, and it is really wonderful to have you here, so thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be talking with you today.
Very, very cool. So we have a traditional first question on the show, which is, what was your first experience or exposure with divination? Was it something that you were sort of practicing when you were a child, or you had a family member who read cards or something like that?
So that's an interesting question for me, because actually the first things that I was doing when I was quite young was direct spirit contact. So it's not exactly divination, but sometimes some of the kind of omen seeking and things like that that come from direct spirit contact when you're learning how to communicate with spirits. So that would be some of the first, but my first kind of specific divination, now I'm being trained, that would be tarot cards when I was in college. That would have been the first time. But like I said, I was doing a lot of other kind of strange spirit work before that.
So with the strange spirit contact that you were talking about, what was kind of your entryway into that? What?
That's a good question, because I mean, I make no sense to myself without reincarnation. I just don't, because none of this stuff comes out of my family. My family are kind, people who encourage me and think it is weird. So this is not something that comes from a family tradition. Now, I should say that though, that when I say that, there is actually a family tradition. It just was a hidden tradition that I didn't know about until much, much, much later because it was my great grandmother. And then everyone converted to a form of Christianity where they kind of do not talk about these things. And it wasn't until I was way later in life that all of a sudden I heard them talking about her as being a prophet. I'm like, wait, what? Because as far as I knew, I was the only one that had any of this stuff. So there is that, but I don't honestly know a lot about it other than it was there. So yeah, I mean, some of the early things I was doing when I was really little, I was talking to the goddess Artemis. I was talking to spirits, perceiving them, usually more through kind of the perception that they're there and then hearing and knowing that they're there rather than direct sight. But, I could also kind of like when you're looking and your mind is superimposing a visual, sometimes that. So that's just stuff I was doing when I was little. And I didn't think anything weird about it because I was too young to think it was anything weird until I later discovered it was weird. So that's some of my early background. When I was well into this, like I want to say maybe late 20s, early 30s, is the first time that I had discovered that my great grandmother was considered a prophet in the area. And but they all had converted to a different form of Southern Baptist, and so nobody ever talked about it until in hushed tones I caught my grandpa talking about it. And as soon as I did, I'm like, wait, what are you saying? Like, I'm not the only one, because they didn't know about me because I just had also not shared it with them. And then they shut up. So I really know almost nothing about it, except that apparently there was a tradition in there somewhere in my grandfather's line that has to do with some of this. And apparently, the piece that I got is that my great grandmother always knew when you're lying. She knew what the weather was going to have. She knew when someone was going to die, and there were a few other things like that were there, but it was considered kind of like not something you wanted to talk about. So I didn't know until late that this was not just me individually being weird, which I am, but
I think we
yeah,
all
that
are,
there
but
is a
yeah,
family. Exactly, nothing wrong with that, right?
exactly. No, that's really fantastic. So when you say at a young age, what age are we talking about with this spirit contact with Artemis? Because I
So
actually had childhood contact with Artemis as well, so I'm like, oh, you know.
which makes sense, right? Because among other things, she is the protector of young children and especially young girls. And so it's a little hard for me to exactly pinpoint it, like exactly when it was, but it was early. I want to say it was at least early grade school, if not before that. Well, I mean, definitely like first grade, if not before. So, I mean, I remember I prayed to Artemis for my little sister because I found out my mom was pregnant and I already had two brothers and I wanted a sister. And I remember I prayed to Artemis for a sister and I got my sister. So I was extremely excited. So, and that would have been, I was 6. So it must have been at least then, if not earlier. Yeah, but I
Yeah.
think she appears to young children, and especially those of us who are walking around with, connections to her from past incarnations. And it makes sense why she would show up to young girls,
Yeah.
to me.
Oh, absolutely. I completely agree. It makes total sense. So your path then has had that connection to the Greek gods, which of course your book that I'm sure we will be talking more about is all about, in terms of helping people connect to those deities and get to know them in the modern context. Did your path lead you to those Hellenic waters right away, or were there other sort of religious threads that came before that?
So I was raised Christian, and I did not see that there was a necessary distinction between them because when you're little, you don't think like that. So when I was young, I did not have any issues at all with going to church. I enjoyed it. I got, I mean, I've always had this spiritual side. And so I just didn't have the exclusivity figured out. No. And to this day, I don't have, from the way in which I personally was raised in the form of Christianity that my parents were, which was very open and loving and all of these different things. It was a little different than the part of the family that was the kind of strict Southern Baptist, which would be more my extended family. I didn't have issues. So it wasn't until later that it was like, oh, well, okay, now I have some problems with like the historical church. And if you're going to make me choose, I'm going to choose the Greek gods because they're the ones that are like deep in my heart. But I didn't have an issue with those two things. So I was raised Christian. I went to church all the way through high school. When I go back and I'm with my parents, their church is really important to them. I go with them. I have no problem being there and holding space. I think it's important to hold space for the sacred, how other people understand it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I have always had, my heart is deeply moved and always has been by the Hellenic Theoi.
So you are a leader within the pagan community. You also identify as a theosophist. Can you
Yes.
maybe, for there may be listeners here who are extremely familiar with what that is, but maybe if you, for people who are not, can you give us a
Sure.
bite-sized version?
Yeah, so I encountered theosophy when I was in my early 20s. And I came to everything. I was already a witch. I was already a pagan. At that point, I was out there saying, this is what I am. I'd already been that way since I was in my late teens. And as I was looking at things, as I said, I did not have a challenged relationship personally with Christianity. It wasn't mine at that point, but I understood the value of it. And I've always had this kind of seeking for spiritual truth beyond whatever package it comes in, if that makes sense. So the Theosophical Society is a group that was founded in the late 19th century. And you might know the names of like Madame Helena Blavatsky, right? You might know the name of Annie Besant. Those are the two first international presidents of the Theosophical Society. And what they were trying to do was to say, like, look, there is something that is true. There is no religion that is higher than truth. And there can be truth found in every religion. And so there is value in every religion. And what we're trying to do is to understand what is the deep spiritual truth that lies in back of the various historical religions as we understand them, and to learn from all the great wisdom traditions. And to do that in a way that has the possibility of taking us individually and collectively, it's got a very definite kind of collective vision through spiritual evolution. So, a lot of the kinds of ways in which even now contemporary pagans think about spiritual evolution, it comes out of some of these older traditions that are starting to look at this kind of thing. And actually, like the Theosophical Society, its influence is very strong in contemporary paganism. I mean, if you think about it, something like they brought a lot of the Indian traditions and put them in conversation with Western mystery traditions. So if you have a pagan who's talking about karma, that's where it's coming from, things like that. And so I got a lot of value out of some of the very big picture thinking and this approach to religions that allows you to be deeply respectful, learn from other traditions, and also to find ways, which I think is important, to support people in their own spiritual growth, even when they have a very different path than yours. So, for instance, for me, when I would go to people and I would say, how can I, as a witch, support you in your spiritual path? As a Hindu, as a Christian, as a whatever, like, what does that look like? And so I was very drawn to that kind of thing. But they also have some really, really important occult texts that are really interesting. So that's kind of Theosophy. Theosophical Society still exists. I have been very engaged in the National Theosophical Society, as well as in the National Capital Lodge, which is the local DC lodge that was founded in the late 19th century as well. So does that help?
Oh yes, absolutely. No, that's really lovely, and I appreciate that piece of the looking for what is behind it, and also looking for ways to engage with others, which I think is also a very polytheist viewpoint anyway.
Yeah.
Because Get to know your gods. We'll get to we'll
Right.
yeah.
Exactly. So, yeah.
Speaking of that, getting to know the gods,
Mhm.
what was it that led you, would you say, to knowing you needed to write this book that you have put out into the world? Like, what was the inspiration for that creation?
Yeah, so I've been trying to think about, what are the different ways, and I still do this all the time. Like, how are the different ways I can serve? How can I serve the divine? How can I serve the theoi? How can I serve the humans who I encounter? And for many years, I have been asked, what book should I recommend to someone who is looking for an entryway into this that is a good book that will give a very good background that then they can take and move forward in whatever their path is. And honestly, there's some good things out there, but I wanted something that would be like, here's the overview that I always wish that somebody would have given me, that, you can then take and build on it and have all the pieces that you need to establish a good, stable practice. And then it will give you a foundation from which, if you're interested in this particular God or you're interested in this particular kind of practice, you have a foundation enough to go work on that and go from there. So that's kind of what I wanted to do. And also recognizing that I'm in a place of privilege. I'm an academic librarian. I have access to all the books I could ever want. And that is not something that most people have. So I wanted to be able to give to somebody if they had only one book and then they were going to gradually maybe add in a book here or a book there, that it could be that foundational piece that would cover all the basics. So, the basics of how you build a relationship. You can learn an awful lot more about any one of the individual gods in particular. That's, it doesn't have long pieces on any of them, but it gives a chance to encounter them and gives strategies for how you could go about doing that. It talks about the mysteries, talks about philosophy, talks about, how do you build sacred space, talks about family practice, talks about, magic for the, or like religion for the polis and how we might do that now. So I was trying to come up with something that would be able to introduce people to kind of every facet in a comprehensive enough way that depending on what their interests are and what's calling to their spirit, they could then build from there. Does that help?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And it's true because with the sort of the Greeks and the Romans, we do have an enormous amount of quote like text evidence, which some of the other, more northern traditions do not because of the lack of writing things down until much later. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there are good footholds for people that are not either
Right.
overwhelming or academic and locked up in libraries that we don't have access to.
Right.
um,
Right.
yeah, that is it's a excellent book. I've already
Oh,
recommended it
thank
to a few
you.
people. So the title is also very evocative. So for people who may not understand the title, can you tell us a little bit about why you chose that?
Yeah, so I mentioned that for me, I make no sense to myself without reincarnation. I just don't. So the Waters of Mnemosyne are a reference to the Orphic mysteries. And the Orphic mysteries, the mystery traditions of the ancient Hellenic world, all have to do with what happens to you after you die, essentially. So they change something in your pattern after you die. And the Orphic mysteries in particular are pretty explicit about the fact that this has to do with reincarnation. And it has to do with, in some level, maintaining a continuity of consciousness across the bridge of death and rebirth, which doesn't mean that you remember everything. I don't remember everything I did last week, much less everything I did 20 years ago or 2,000 years ago, but that it can build that bridge so that you're maintaining some level of continuity of consciousness, because the really difficult thing as mortal beings is that we die and we come back and we have to start over. So it's kind of like constantly going back to kindergarten over and over again. And if you believe in the possibilities of spiritual evolution individually and collectively, which I do, then that is a huge challenge that needs to be overcome. So if you can come back in and have some sort of pathway where you get back to what you used to know in terms of your wisdom faster, then you have a chance of growing further. And so the Orphic mysteries talk about a certain amount of that in terms of this ability to maintain some level of continuity of consciousness so that we don't have to start from square one every single time. So, the specific Waters of Mnemosyne, there is a formula that you are trained in the Orphic mysteries that is something that happens when you die. You come to a place in which the natural path is that you are to drink the waters of lethe, which is of course where we get the word lethal, but it has to do with forgetting. That's where we forget everything. And that's the natural path, is that you drink the waters of lethe. And when you come to the place where you naturally drink the waters of lethe, you say, I am a child of earth and starry heaven, but my race is of heaven alone. Give to me the waters of Mnemosyne, which are mine to drink by right. That's how I remember it. And the waters of Mnemosyne, those are the waters of memory. Mnemosyne is, among other things, the goddess of the muses, because all of the great human arts require memory. But in that moment, it is also a reference. And in some way, this is like, there's something that marks you when you go through the initiation so that you have this intercession available to you. And therefore, it is a way to bypass this full forgetting, which, I think, therefore, part of what's happening is a kind of ritualistic equivalency of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Because again, like the Dalai Lama doesn't come in remembering everything. He doesn't remember what he ate 70 years ago. Nobody does, but he remembers the essentials and they continue to unfold. And so therefore you're able to serve and able to grow at a different level. So I think that's what's happening. If I am correct, and if that is, it is certainly what the Orphic mysteries were claiming, then there should be some of us wandering around with some of this. And so that's how I make sense to myself. So that is part of what I'm doing there is the waters of Mnemosyne. It's a reference to the Orphic mysteries, but it's also a call to the readers to kind of be open in themselves to the possibility that on some level they have been initiates and there is memory that can unfold within them. So that's why I named it that.
It's very beautiful, and I really appreciate the explanation of that because I think it's a really important thing for people to be aware of, and it is something about the Hellenic traditions, its connection to mystery rites, like the Orphic mysteries, that is probably also, I think, calling to people, and that
Mhm.
awakening of people is I would not be surprised and totally agree with you that that is also that some of us are wandering around
Yeah.
with that memory, that collective memory. So this ties beautifully into something I wanted to ask you, which was about the mystery traditions in the modern day and kind of their place, if there are to be any place for them in the modern sort of Hellenic rebirth. I've had Peter Mark Adams on a few times, and actually,
Mhm.
I think he will have been my previous guest for this episode, talking about the mysteries of
Awesome.
Mithras. So,
Yes.
there's awakening a lot of interest in the mysteries of Dionysus and Mithras and the Orphic mysteries. And as a person who is a leader within sort of the rebirth of Hellenic ideas, what do you feel would be possible? Would it be possible to bring some of these mystery traditions back? How do you see that working?
Yeah. So the main thing that it takes is it has a combination of us reaching from this side and then all of these mysteries. They have great ones who have chosen out of, I believe, out of deep compassion to create these pathways for mortals. And so it's a combination of us reaching and them reaching and us meeting and then finding ways to do this. I will say that I do not believe if there are any who are doing it in the ancient way, I don't yet know about them. So I'm not going to say that there's nobody doing it, but if they are, I haven't found it and I look a lot. So, but I do think that there is this reaching over from the other side. And so I think it's a matter of us trying to make that connection and trying to trust ourselves that we can do it. I mean, I think this is one of the things that is the hardest for all of us who are born in this time and in this place, which is those of us who are doing this kind of work, we tend to have been socialized in ways to be very skeptical of our own abilities. And on the one hand, you need to have critical thinking. We don't want to become things like, conspiracy theory people or people who are like, I'm denying evidence and just going with whatever I think. But then the danger is, in order to believe that you are actually talking to one of the great ones, you have to have some confidence that this is something that is real and that you're bringing something through. And it's going to require that if we're going to really rebirth the mysteries. I have now been in numerous rituals in which different people have been aspecting different ones of the great ones, or have been in situations where I'm getting things. I think that they want this. I think that, and in fact, I believe that they gave them to us in the beginning, that the fact that they have degraded, fallen apart, been frankly suppressed, that this is not something that the great ones want. And therefore, there are times in which this happens. Um, every single thing that we have that is a religious rite began as somebody's unverified personal gnosis. And so I think that we have to be open to that. Again, you want to be reasonable. You don't want to drink a poison because somebody said to. Check it. But at the same time, I think that we need to also be open and willing to recognize that if we really believe these things, then why wouldn't the gods continue to reach out? So I think that there is a moment where I think this is necessary, and I am sensing an awful lot of kind of hands like this. We're reaching for each other, and so I think it's going to happen. So we'll just have to see exactly how it happens. And part of the way I think that, I should say, like, I see so many places where the Hellenic great ones have been reaching out strongly, and you can see it in things like popular culture. You can see it in how many people are getting this kind of like, oh, I'm being called to Mithras. That's awesome to know about. That's totally awesome. There's just a lot of that happening right now. And like, I'm seeing it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree. I remember when I was a baby pagan and I would show up and I would be one, it felt like I would be one of the few that was like, oh, it's mostly the Greek gods for me. And everyone else, it was like the other strands were more present, shall we say. And now it is interesting to kind of feel a shift. And I think it's great. We need the old great ones from all the
Mhm.
traditions.
Yeah.
So to see that kind of reaching out happening, I do see that kind of happening more and more, which is beautiful.
Mhm.
With that reaching hands towards one another, you also lead trips to go to Greece and to
Yeah.
connect with the Theoi on their home turf, shall we say? So what led you to first doing that? I mean, I've been to Greece a few times. I know why I want to go and why it's powerful for
Mhm.
me. But was it just something that grew naturally and you were just going, or did you get like a call that you knew you needed to bring people with you and this was what you needed to do?
So I had gone a couple of times. It took me way later in life than I would have liked, but money is money. And so we all have our limitations based on our physical realities. And then when I came back, it was so profound. And I received various calls while I was there that really have structured my work since. Um, and I would tell people about them. And I was just so excited. And I started to have people saying, well, can you take me? Can you take me? And so thankfully, one of the people who's very dear to my heart, Monica, who is another high priestess in the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel, she is also a travel agent. And so while I can be like, we need to go here and we need to go there and we shouldn't miss this. And like, I think we can do it all this way. And I can talk to people about what's important. But I don't know how to book a tour bus and I don't know how to, but she does. So that combination, I've now done this 3 times. So we're like, okay, let's see if we can get enough like pagan people that will want to go, that we can manage to have this happen. And so we just did the third one this past summer, earlier in the summer. I will say I used to go around July 4th. I have now moved it up into, the earlier part of like mid-May, early June, because it is getting hotter and hotter. Climate change is real. And I would not want to take people over there if this is possibly their only time to go to Greece and be like, well, no Acropolis for you. So that's a real thing just for people to know.
Heat stroke would not be a nice part of your spiritual journey
No.
memory. So, yeah, I completely agree with that. When people are able to go on these journeys, I have also heard more about people being called to do sacred travel, not just to Greece, but to
Mhm.
Ireland, to Scotland, to the Norse countries and things like that. What is it about going to these places that you think is important for people, or what is it that is different, even if you do have a wonderful practice, where you
Yeah.
live?
So I think there's a few different things. I mean, first of all, I think that the gods are anywhere. You can connect with them. But there's no doubt that there is something precious and sacred about being in a place where they have been worshipped and you are walking in places that are particularly sacred. I mean, when you are in Delphi, you are in Delphi, you know? And one of the big places every time I go where people are just, incredibly moved, it's usually a lot of people's favorite is Eleusis, for the Eleusinian mysteries, where you are in the place. Here is the cave that is the Platonian cave. Here you are in the Telestadion, where thousands upon thousands of people for thousands of years were going through this initiation. There is something very profound that gets written into the geography when you're there, and the ability to sit in a place where you know what has happened there. So that's just something that's important. I think the other thing that is profound for Americans, and this may be also profound for like Canadians, Australians, maybe some others. One of the things that is different is many of us, because we're all immigrants, and there's a particular, I mean, unless you're a First Nations person, there's a particular kind of power and beauty that comes with that as well. But it means that we tend to have this sense of history that is somewhat disembodied. So you have this kind of in a galaxy long, long ago, far, far away kind of, Joseph Campbell approach. But when you go to Greece and you're like, I am standing in the place that Heracles stood, and there he fought the Hydra. And I am there. And I am here where he stood in front of his uncle. I mean, it is just so different. I am standing at the altar of Delphi. It's just a very, very different experience. And at least for me, and I've talked to others, there is something weirdly healing about that because it has this kind of rootedness in place that connects you with the stories with the gods and is like immediate, like you are embodied and in this place. And I don't know that it's necessarily, I don't know whether or not it is. It might be just as amazing if you were someone who grew up in a place where the mythology that you grew up with was like rooted like that. But that's not an immigrant experience. So I think in that way, that's
Yeah,
a profound thing.
yeah, absolutely. That's a very, very good thing for us to think about, because also, place has its own spirit, and
Oh,
we are all, of course, inspirited on the lands where we live. But then being able to travel and experience the difference of different places and the
yeah.
different spirit contact that is individual with different places is, I think, also important.
Yeah.
Um,
If I could just add one more thing to
yeah.
that, if I am correct about reincarnation, and I think I am, that's the other piece that, like, walking in places where your spirit had been previously, there is something different because it helps awaken. I mean, I found so many more memories coming through, coming through, coming through. And that is something that maybe not everyone is going to have when they go there. I mean, there's places that I love. I think they are completely awesome. I am moved by the art, but they don't do any of that for me. And then it just felt like every single step I was taking. I think I was Greek for a really, really, really long time. So for me, that's also like my mother rock.
Yeah, no. Totally, completely agree. Um, so when we are then sort of turning to the other side of this, which is one thing that well, you did a lovely talk on this at Sacred Space, the importance of household worship and setting up
Yeah.
rituals, for oneself where you are. And I think that
Mhm.
connects to the piece of what you were, I'm sure, doing in your private teachings, but also in the book of helping people form relationships with the gods and with the spirits in a way that is doable in their everyday life.
Mhm.
So, can you maybe talk just a little bit about household worship and how that fits into a practice for people who are maybe starting out?
Yeah. So I think that bringing back into this notion of embodiment, like I love going to Greece. That's awesome. But you know where else I love? I love going into the creeks that are like right down the road from me and being in my neighborhood and things of that nature, because we're also embodied here. And I think one of the big draws for me, one of the things that moves my heart and is exciting about kind of polytheistic pagan practice generally, so it's not just Hellenic, is the fact that there are all sorts of other intelligences that maybe may or may not be embodied in the moment. So sometimes they're like nature intelligences, but there's all sorts of intelligences around that we can build relationships with. And that's just cool. I mean, it just enriches your life so much. So, some of the things that I do think it is a good idea to have some sort of household practice and begin working with the spirit of the household. Now, I'll say I'm also on that animistic side as well, which, many of us are. There's nothing inherently like I would consider myself to be a polytheist. I'm also an animist. I'm also a kind of monist. I'm also, I believe in the divine, of which we are all a part, all that kind of thing. All these things are not contradictory. You can have a very rich, complicated view of the ultimate nature of reality. But I think having relationships and trying to build relationships with the household and the house as a being is a good thing to do. So I like having a household altar and practice. I like trying to be aware of how to bring sacred meaning to just the normal things that can seem mundane, but also sometimes aren't. So things like, when I'm trying to do cleaning of my house, also be thinking about like what is the health of the household, and I'm doing this kind of spiritual cleaning as well. I love altars, but I will also say, there's a lot of different things that you can do. You can kind of see some of the stuff I have around. So different things that, that I have, that I do. But I also would say, don't overcomplicate. It is better to do something than nothing. So I know in my book, I'm like, well, I've lived in tiny, tiny, tiny apartments. I am an urban dweller for years. I lived in a studio apartment that was 300 square feet. I did not have place for big bookcases and altars and all that kind of stuff. I was excited when I got it, but I may not have it again in the future. And so sometimes having a place where it's just like, here is my household candle that is my hearth, and I am doing that. So I think though it helps you ground your spiritual reality in your embodied lived experience, and therefore also sacralizes your daily life, which ultimately I see us all as being kind of an earth school. So sacralizing your daily life and your own growth is a good thing.
Yeah, yeah. So that every day is our prayer, in a sense, the lived prayer.
Right,
And
right.
there's another point that I recall. I really appreciated the point that you make about the nature of community and the nature of the households and who our members of households are.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe very different from what, shall I say, like ancient Greeks or Romans or other, peoples in other cultures now today may recognize. But I think it's an important point. Also, I think it's wonderful and might tie into you are, an important person within the sacred space and other communities that are growing and getting larger and larger with the number of people that are being sort of invited into that larger picture. So, can you maybe tell us what you mean by like the community of the household and your
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I think is important is for us to look creatively at the opportunities that we have to try to give birth to the types of society and the types of living situations that we want. So, the whole point of this is that the old ikoyenyakos, right, which is the old family household structure that is traditional, that just isn't going to work for anybody anymore, if I'm honest about it. That is a long, it's an extended family relationship. The kind of nuclear family as a social form fell apart very quickly for very good reasons. And we're in this moment in which the old is broken down, the new has not yet been birthed. So, one of the calls that I had in that section, and the goddess Hera is the one who is really kind of poking at me for a lot of that, which is interesting because she's not one of the ones that I tend to work with as much, but she is, I think, very misunderstood in a lot of ways, understandably for the myths and all of that. But she's very much about the kind of ethics of care, the household, lineage, all that kind of thing. And the point is that we don't have right now the new model. We talk about our families of choice, but we don't really have a way of formalizing that and understanding it. And so part of what I was saying is like, we have an opportunity to try to think about what it is that we would want, knowing that we're not likely to ever go back to the extended family, which everyone is co-located and doing things of that nature. I mean, I could be wrong. Maybe that will happen again. But nuclear families are too small. There's not enough there to be able to really support each other when things really are in crisis is a large part of what happens. Like, the old, well, it's not really even all that old, the notion of like your spouse is supposed to be everything to you. Well, one person is not a support network. I mean, there are reasons that doesn't work. And if one of you is in crisis, probably both of you are. So finding ways to figure that out. So, what I was suggesting is we could formalize some of these relationships. And one of the things that is there from the ancient Greek tradition is the notion of like the bosom friend, the friend who is so close that they are a part of family and this is very ancient, they are traditionally able to step in if there is duty for one of the family members that they can't meet. That is somebody who could step in and do it. So we might consider, in our current situation, how might we formalize those relationships and those kind of abilities to be of support to each other in a way that is sacralized. So that is part of it. But I think also, just in general, one of the things that I see is like a spirit sickness in our current society. I'm always looking for like, where's spirit sickness? Where's miasma, which I call, the kind of notion of spiritual pollution. Where's the healing that needs to happen? Is that human beings are social animals. We're political animals, which really does mean social animals, as Aristotle would say it, that we bond together and we organize ourselves in communities that are larger than just our blood kindred, right? And so that is part of our nature. But a lot of our traditions have become extremely individualistic. And so, how is it that we understand community and relationships and can really, really rebuild those in ways that are meaningful? And I think if there is any one thing that is a huge social crisis right now, it's largely that. And that's gotten worse since the pandemic. So, anyway, when we're talking about like the sacred space community and all of these other communities, it's also a matter to me of helping us be able to come together, kind of like we were calling it the gathering of the tribes. When we just went to this last trip in Greece, there were three different major pagan communities that we drew from in that group that went. And it's kind of this notion of, can we gather together? Can we build these relationships of real friendship with each other and find ways to be mutually supportive and start building the kind of life and the kind of structures we would want?
It is interesting, and I think it is interesting because I've talked to so many people outside of paganism and within it, who
Yeah.
we are all feeling that crisis. It's sort of reaching a crisis point, I think, of that social network needing to be rebuilt, and people realizing that they're looking around and there's something missing, and
Mhm.
people have it in different forms, but we can definitely do more. And I think what you're talking about is each of us reaching out to try to do that. I think it's important also to talk about it more because then you
Mhm.
don't feel like it's just you who's like, oh, is it just me? Nope. No, it's
Yeah.
not. There's a lot of people who
No.
feel that these connections are very important.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's useful for us to just recognize, when I pull back and I look at more from like a sociological angle, there used to be tons of voluntary associations. First of all, there used to be the churches, but then there were also tons of voluntary associations that when you would work and then you would stop your work at a reasonable point in the day and you weren't doing the kind of commuting that we're doing and all that other kind of thing, then you had all these voluntary associations of people that would be getting together, they're building community with each other. They're usually also doing some sort of relatively selfless good in the world that feeds your sense of kindness. And but that there's structures for that. There were structures that allowed this to happen, that helped people become better humans. And that's just gone. I mean, if you look across the board, a lot of that is utterly destroyed. And if you do find some that are still active, they almost always are full of people who are very elderly at this point. So I know, since I work in higher ed, our students really struggle. They don't necessarily know how to build close relationships, and they don't have the kind of structures that prior generations might have had that would have helped them do a lot of these things. So yeah, I think there's a lot of room for creative creation. What is that? For creative approaches. But like, I'm kind of a builder. I like to build institution. That's something I like.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I have a couple of questions that lead off from that. You are a leader in a number of different aspects and a number of different areas. And I think sometimes when I've spoken to people who want to build that sense of community, they either have tried and burned out.
Yeah.
That one I've definitely heard a few times.
Hmm.
Or they're just not sure where to start. So
Hmm.
what is some advice that you could give to people that you think they could hear to either not burn out or get started in a way that doesn't lead to burnout?
Yeah, that's huge, because wearing yet a different hat, because I do also have a hat in which I have done scholarly research on contemporary pagans, usually survey-based research. And I did a study in which I was looking at pagan leaders and clergy and burnout. And burnout is huge. It is such a big challenge. And I think the biggest problem there is that most of us are doing this on top of everything else, where it's like, you have a full-time job. Many of us have very demanding full-time jobs. I know I certainly do. And then you have your family life and you have all the stuff that you need to do over here. And then we're also often like running a coven or running whatever. So there's just a lot that's there. So I want to first acknowledge that that is a very, very real thing. And it is different than in the more mainstream traditions where you have professional clergy who are able to do this as their job. I will point out, and Irene Glass actually has pointed this out to me, is like there is something to be said about joining the UUs, because then they do actually have a professional clergy track, which enables you to kind of have more infrastructure and be able to spend more time there. And she's certainly a great example of a fabulous leader. And part of that is that she has that structure of support. So the other part of it that I would say then is like looking for structures of support. Part of the reason why I ended up joining and moving some of the work that I was doing into the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel is thanks to the elders there and the vision of the founding elders. There is a really, really good supportive structure there, so that it is not just one priestess, priestess trying to hold everything together. You have a community of people from a number of different covens that are in formal relationships with each other. There are things we can do magically that you couldn't do otherwise because you just don't have the people. And there's the kind of support that you can provide each other. So I think that's part of it, is like look to see whether or not there are nascent organizations that are there that are healthy for you in alignment with what you want to do. But I do think that is the other thing that, if we could figure out how to do it, building more of that kind of structure. Like I said, the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel has its own. I know there are some other groups, but looking at the ways in which we can build formal alliances with other groups and be able to really support each other. And of course, the other piece of that, which is part of what I was looking for, and this would be a talk on occult initiations, which, I am planning on developing for the Theosophical Society. But if you are really doing the kind of occult initiation work, that is something that if you're doing it right, it means you are trying to accelerate your own development in ways that there are always dangers of going off the deep end. And if you want to be in a situation as a leader where you're going to actually actively pursue that, part of what you absolutely must have are a group of level-headed peers who will tell you the honest truth and hold you accountable, because it is not safe for you to do that work without it. So that is another thing I will say. If we're going to do this work, and I think we should, because I think the world needs us to be accelerating our development individually and collectively, but we must face the risks of that and build in supports. So that's another piece that I would say is like look for building that network of peers. And then you don't want the people who are going to tell you what you want to hear. You're going to want the people who tell you what you need to hear. And then if they say something, you must listen. So
Oh, yeah, the tricky part.
yeah. I mean,
Oh,
Aristotle once
absolutely.
said, yeah. And I think, part of this is like Aristotle once said that friendship is the highest virtue, it's the highest human excellence. And there is no need for justice amongst true friends, because when you are a true friend to somebody, then your highest wish is for their highest good. And that also calls you to, if you see someone who is going down a road where they are now going off the deep end and you are really their friend, you have to say it, you know? And so that's like how you become true friends and grow in that way. So there's
Yeah.
that.
No, I absolutely could not agree more on that. Denise and I, my co-head priestess and I, talk about the importance of the buddy system, but buddy system is not just two people. That's minimum.
Yeah.
You really need a larger network than that.
Right.
Otherwise, it is not safe out there.
Right. Right. Yeah.
A number of
Not if you're really
different.
doing the work. Yeah.
Yeah. So what is I like to sometimes ask what is one misunderstanding or misconception about your practices that you've had to encounter a lot? And in this case, I'm thinking more along the lines of Hellenic worship or something that you've had when
Mhm.
you bring it up, people will be like, oh, but don't you blah, blah. And then you have to correct that. What is something that you have heard come up?
Yeah. So I don't know if it's exactly a misunderstanding as a difference in values and perspective or something. Let me think if I can figure out how to say this. I am not a Reconstructionist. And I want to say, and this is part of why I want to figure out how to frame this. I don't actually have anything but respect for people who are Reconstructionists, that is a different path, that is something where they are very, very much into trying to do things the way they were done in wherever. And my challenge with it, though, is a lot of times what they mean by that when there's like, oh, but this is real. It's like, oh, do you mean fourth century Athens? So there's a challenge there of if you're really going to do that, having like an understanding of what is the breath. Because to me, and this is a difference in like our path and approach and our understanding of the gods and what we want, so to me, when I look at something like you can look at Mycenaean times, then you can look all the way to the fall of Christianity. There's so much variety in that, and then all the way across. So, and what I see is there's a perpetual interplay, like I said, with the great ones reaching out, us reaching back, and us finding ways to work together within the context of the moment. So, I am not a Reconstructionist, but for those who are, that's great, but then don't judge me by pretending I'm a Reconstructionist doing it badly, because I'm not one. So I think that's kind of, that's my challenge sometimes in that dynamic. So and some of this is legitimately rooted in things from ancient Greece. in that ancient Greece has two different major streams that come out in these interesting ways. The birth of the ideal of the cosmopolis, from which we get cosmopolitan, the idea that the world is your polis, and the notion that what is truly Hellenic has to do, it's cultural. It has to do with, do you know the language? Do you worship these particular beings? And that means that people can become that. It doesn't mean it's rooted by blood. That is there. It is born in Greece. It's one of the very, very early times where you see some of this stuff breaking through the restrictions around blood. And then at the same time, you also have, once you have the birth, and it's interesting, it's tied to the birth of democracy in Athens. Once you have the birth of democracy, then you have to figure out who is legitimately a citizen who has the right to vote. And so then you have this backwards move into now we have to be really careful about who has the right blood. So you have both, and they both come out of ancient Greece. They are both legitimately ancient Greek. I am on the cosmopolitan side. Just going to say that. That's where I stand. So I think, it's not exactly, that people don't understand it. It's more like, where is it that we draw that line of what is authenticity, I think. Is the authenticity primarily in form? Is the authenticity primarily in connection? Connection is hard to prove. I get that. But, I think that's one of the types of dynamics that internally can cause some challenge sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's also challenging because while you come from a scholarly background, so I'm sure that you appreciate good scholarship and good
I
research.
do.
So the importance of that is obviously there. However, there is a limit that has to be acknowledged of how we are a different culture and we speak different languages in different times. And that has always been the case. And it is still the case now. So we're going to be reinventing and reconnecting.
Yeah. And I
Without
do
any
think,
choice.
yeah, it's really a tough one because, like, as you said, like, I love the scholarship. I read it and I find ways to connect into it. And I do think it can lead you to where there are types of power and things of that nature that are like lying around that you can reactivate. So I see a lot of value in it, but I don't want to be confined by it to the point where it kills out the spirit
Yep.
because then it doesn't matter to me. So
And that clearly ties into the theosophical
yeah.
work that we were talking about towards the beginning
Mhm.
of looking what are the threads underneath that, because then that is how you can try to bring that back or come up with a new form for that, even if you are
Yeah.
not going to do it all in ancient Greek with the animal sacrifice on the side.
Right.
And yet you are still looking for that piece that's under it. So that is very
Yeah.
beautiful.
And I should say one more thing just to be clear about it, because I don't want to feel, I don't want to leave with like misconceptions. I also understand and I really get this. And I think in ways that probably most American Hellenic pagans kind of don't necessarily know this context. There's a really, really big difference in the context that like a Greek, like ethnically Greek in Greece polytheists are working with and ours. And the big difference there is that we have absolutely no protection unless what we do is considered a religion. The First Amendment, is the only thing that we have that protects us in a society that still is predominantly and becoming ever more so in certain ways politically Christian. The Greek context, they have an established religion, and that established religion, according to their constitution, is the Greek Orthodox Church. And so they want to be really careful that they're not running afoul of that. And so a lot of times they'll be like, stop calling us a religion. We are a way of life. And the truth is, any religion, if it's a real religion, is a way of life that is also sacred. But we are in different political contexts. And I think that is worth just remembering.
Oh, yes. Yes. Very,
Yeah,
very important to recognize that is another living cultural difference. Just when we're talking about ancient cultures, we're also talking about living
right
cultures
now.
right now that are very different. So
Yeah.
those assumptions are important not to be made. So when it could do harm. So is
Mhm.
there something that you would like to, because of course, I want to ask about what you have coming up and things like that, but I always like to leave space for someone to share if there's a thing that you would like people to think with more these days, or if there's a thing that you find yourself saying more right now to people, that it keeps coming up in conversation or in your teachings that you'd like to leave people with.
So, one of the things that I would like to see in the overall, this is, not just Hellenic pagans or whatever, the overall pagan traditions, would like us to spend a little bit more of our time and energy thinking about philosophy. And the reason why I want to say that is, I think that we are doing such a good job in rebirthing our sacred relationships with the divine in lots of different pantheons. And I think that's amazing. And I think we're doing a good job. We could always do a better job, but we can do a good job and are doing a good job in ritual. And we're doing some good work in the arts. But philosophy is also ours. I mean, it is to live the life as a lover of wisdom. And one of the things that I find so valuable is, and I'm not saying everybody has to go like read Plato and Aristotle. I mean, I would love it if they would because they're awesome. But, at the same time, they are ours, man. I mean, it's like this comes out of legitimate pre-Christian traditions. But the thing that I find so valuable in so many of these traditions that I would like to see us begin to more intentionally create is it's not just the notion of what is the true nature of reality, which is that's part of it, but it's also what does that mean to live a good human life? Because at this moment, when I look at things like in my professional life, I'm doing a lot with AI and ethics and things of that nature. And in so many ways, the real questions that need to be asked are not the ones that our society is asking. And I wish that we, as people who are rebirthing these ancient wisdom, pagan traditions, we have something to bring to this table. And I wish that we would, because the main questions that keep being asked is like, what is it that the technology can do? And is that good or is that bad? And the place we need to start with is what is it that a real human life looks like? What are the things that ought to be done by humans? And then you can take a look and see, well, now is this something that can be outsourced to technology in an ethical way or not? But we're not starting with a real deep understanding of why are we here and what does a good human life look like individually and collectively. And I think we have something to bring to the table there. And so I would encourage us to more deeply think about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I will just add slightly to that, that I think that it is sometimes frustrating for me, even though this is slightly outside of just the philosophical vein, but it's frustrating to me when I feel like polytheism as a worldview, when we are like practitioners of things, that is a way that it kind of shapes the way you look at the world, and that is
Oh,
not
yeah.
discussed enough. And I think we do have a lot to say about
Hmm.
pluralism in society and what that means, because looking at it
Absolutely.
from the perspective of a monotheist versus a polytheist, I think it's different philosophically. So,
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really is. And I think when I look at things again through the lens of like miasma, what is the spiritual pollution? Because we are cells in the greater beings, including in our overculture, whether we want to be in this overculture or not, we are. And so, like what are the places where there's kind of the spiritual pollution and how can we heal that? How can we cleanse it and heal it? And I think absolutely the polytheist view, it has a lot that is different and brings a different vision of human thriving. And I think right now we don't have a collective good vision of human thriving, and we need one.
yeah, we need
So
that
yeah,
good imagination, the imagination for
ex-
the good in that sense. Yeah.
exactly. And I mean, and again, like part of it that I wish that we could spend more time thinking about philosophy in a way, not as like, let's read a bunch of texts, but to live life as a philosopher is just to live it as someone who really truly deeply, because philos, that has to do with the deep intimate love. It's not abstract, so how do you live as a true lover of wisdom, someone who is a real close intimate friend with wisdom? I think that's a beautiful thing that we could be bringing and bringing out more.
Yeah. Well, that is wonderful. I think that's a beautiful thing to sort of close with, except that I would like to, you mentioned something about an initiation and things that you're going to be teaching. Where can people find you and what do you have coming up? Of course, there's going to be, links to your site and books and all that in the show notes, but anything in particular?
Thank you. I need to update my site. I'm really bad at that. So,
It's a
so I
constant
have,
thing.
oh,
I'm always
yeah,
back.
that's one place I fall down. Um, so I will be teaching at Sacred Space in February, and I'm very excited about this one because it is another joint conference with the Assembly Between the Worlds, which is run by the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel. And for those who have never been, it has a big main ritual, which is not something we usually do at Sacred Space, but it's a big main ritual in which the intention of it is tied to the astrology. And the astrology in this one, we are at a turning point. And so any turning point, that can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing. And we are going to be collectively, with as many powerful magical practitioners as possible, jumping on the levers to try to make it good. So I would encourage anyone who can come to that. And I'll be doing a couple of classes there. I will also be doing a 4-class course that is coming up in November to December, and that is through the National Theosophical Society, and that will be on initiation. So it's going to have an overview of basically what is this concept of initiation. It will have one class that's about rites of passage, what they are, and how to create them, because a lot of them, we don't have good rites of passage in lots of places right now. So, like, how might you think about creating them? And then it will have a class on the ancient mystery, the Hellenic mystery initiations. And then the fourth one is going to be on occult initiations as this notion of accelerated growth, um, for the immortal aspect of self. And so that should all be coming up through the Theosophical Society. And that's what
Wonderful.
I'm working on right now.
That is a lot, and I will put links to
Thank you.
all of that in the show notes for people. So I want to thank you so. I will also just plug. I'm going to be at Sacred Space next
Yeah.
year, and I think everyone should go. So if you're listening, you should go. um, I just want to thank you for your time. This has been lovely. I hope that we will
Thank you
have
so
another
much.
discussion like this again. And thank you so much.
I would love that. Thank you so much, Joanna. This has been such a privilege.
Mm.